Before I get started, I just want to thank the organizers of the Manitoba Sustainable Protein Research Symposium for the invitation to speak to you on transitioning dietary patterns with plant protein to support human health. How can protein quality play a role in the changing food landscape? Just an overview of my presentation today and what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to focus on plant protein innovation in the changing food landscape, consumers' functional expectations, protein quality as a pillar of nutrient density for shifting dietary patterns that focus on plant protein. And then finally, how do we bring plant protein quality to the plant protein conversation, separating this into two broad topics, addressing gaps in protein quality as a functional value proposition in the innovation pipeline with a focus on diversification, and then how do we enhance diversity of plant protein Canadian diets, and some of the initiatives that are underway, and some of the gaps that have been highlighted from key opinion leaders up until this point. So let's talk about plant protein innovation in the changing food landscape, consumers' functional expectations. Whenever I start talking about this, I like to talk about key trends that have really gotten to us where we are today. And this is from a major trend report that's published on an annual basis. And as you can see here, protein has been a staple trend in the innovation pipeline for some time, and really shows no sign of slowing down. And then starting around 2016, this plant-based foods trend started to rear its head, and together creating a macro trend around plant protein. 2021 is no different, with this diversification around protein, with some support or trend towards consumption of animal protein and animal protein innovation, but also more broadly alternative proteins, which encompasses plant protein and then plants made convenient, which I think supports what we see today in terms of technological advances with respect to the plant-based protein offerings that we see in the marketplace. This is data that's published also on an annual basis from the International Food Information Council's Food and Health Survey, just to demonstrate some changes in consumption of protein over the last year. And the results here are very similar to previous years around plant protein. But just note here, parsing plant protein foods out into categories of whole plant sources, dairy alternatives, and meat and seafood alternatives like analogs. You can see here that 31%, 23, and 22% of consumers are eating much more now, or somewhat more now, of these foods over the last year compared to other years. And let's not forget of the investment, demonstrating growth of the sector. This is from the Good Food Institute, noting that the increase in investment in the plant protein sector over the last few years, particularly in 2020, 2021, demonstrating exponential growth from 2010 up until now. So with the plant protein story, I would say that very, very broadly, various stakeholders in the food system are acknowledging a changing world and the effects of diet and health on the environment. 2019's Eat Lancet report is quoted as saying, food is the single strongest lever to optimize human health and environmental sustainability on Earth, with the promotion of increased consumption of plant protein. And when we hear about plant protein very, very broadly, it's very hard not to hear things around nutrient density, increased fiber consumption, lower saturated fat intake, reduction in risk of non-communicable diseases like diabetes and cardiovascular disease, and then obviously the effects on the environment with greenhouse gas emissions. And from a business perspective, there's certainly acknowledged value in innovation in this space, with this published SWOT analysis looking at plant-based foods and protein from a business perspective, and just honing in on the strengths around plant protein foods, acknowledging that consumers do believe that they're healthier and have more free from concerns, they're more environmentally friendly, and providing dietary variety that is new and on trend, which for some consumers is a value proposition. But it's important to note that this is largely driven by very, very broad attitudes, motivations, and emotional drivers around food, which is very important because it really is about transitioning the consumer to value things around health and the environment, which we hear talked about all the time when it comes to plant protein. So bringing more context, quality, and sustainability to food choices as the consumer evolves, which is a departure from the past, say from the 60s to the early 2000s, where there really was a lot of value on price and convenience and volume. But it's important to note, while these emotional drivers are very, very important because it's what really resonates and brings the consumer in, we have to acknowledge the function of the food, and the food ultimately has to deliver on function, no matter what you're talking about. So this is a great quote from David Rubin, who says people come to brands for emotional reasons, but they stay for the function. So if we look at some of the, say, the purchase drivers from the International Food Information Council survey that I talked about before, looking at some of those purchase drivers, they're very functional in nature. That is taste, price, healthfulness, convenience, and then finally environmental sustainability was added to the mix. And just to note that they are ranked and fairly consistent over time. You know, taste is king, which is no surprise. Price is very prominent, which is of no surprise also, given especially today's environment that we see around inflation and food prices. And I want to show that healthfulness does resonate also within the top three there. So while we're trying to transition the consumers, and you know, we're acknowledging the value of plant protein can have in the context of dietary patterns, and really trying to hone in on that value proposition for the consumer, we can't forget about those functional drivers, and that ultimately the food does have to deliver on things like nutrition, taste, and texture. So while those emotional drivers are bringing the consumer in, one would argue that it's those functional drivers that are going to keep them there and facilitate that repeat purchase behavior. So with that, I'm going to really hone in now on nutrition as a functional driver, specifically protein quality as a pillar of nutrient density for shifting dietary patterns that focus on plant protein. And with that, I'm going to start with Canada's Food Guide, the latest iteration published in 2019, with that statement that garnered a lot of attention: choose protein foods that come from plants more often, and just focus on what that guideline really encompasses, and that is variety. When we look at the foods that Health Canada is promoting, sure, they start with plant protein foods here, probably because it's the foods that they want individuals to consume more often, but there's also animal-based foods there. But I would argue that despite them, the guideline focusing on variety, it's not really reflecting the changing food landscape that we see today. It's probably for numerous reasons. One of them, perhaps, being that, you know, a lot of the information and the data that went into supporting Canada's Food Guide, the landscape of the food environment in Canada and the US and other regions around the world has changed dramatically since then, with the introduction of technology and different food options that are being offered. But I would also argue that when we look at the rationale and dig a little bit deeper as the rationale as to why they indicate choose plant foods more often, it was more so, it seems, around what plant protein foods traditionally bring to the table, that are bringing to the table in terms of facilitating nutrient-dense and healthy dietary patterns. So for example, we look at plant foods, often they're associated with enhanced intakes of dietary fiber, for example, where it's linked to reductions in LDL cholesterol, reductions in colon cancer, and risk of type 2 diabetes. Vegetable and fruit is associated with lower risk of cardiovascular disease. Nuts is associated with decreased LDL cholesterol, likely because of enhanced consumption of polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fatty acids. Many of these foods, when consumed as a protein food, can displace some animal protein or recalibrate diets around animal protein to lower saturated fat intake, for example. The outlier here being that in Canada, we do have a claim around soy protein LDL cholesterol, but I would even say that that is actually very controversial. In the United States, over the last few years, there's been chatter around retracting that claim. I believe it's been under review for some time, in the sense that there are questions rising as regard to the consistency of the evidence and whether or not the effect of soy protein is from the soy itself, but from a displacement effect from consuming higher levels of soy protein, displacing animal protein in diet, and then bringing down saturated fat intakes. When we look at the effects of, say, plant protein innovative products like meat analogs on cardiometabolic risk factors, the evidence is really scarce. This is a study published spearheaded by Christopher Gardner, published in 2020, looking at some of those newer entrants into the market around meat analogs formulated with pea protein and soy protein, and having individuals consume them 2 servings a day for 8 weeks, compared to corresponding animal products, again, consumed for 8 weeks. And the results of the study demonstrated that those consuming, at the time of consuming plant protein, at the end of the that period, that 8-week period, individuals had lower weight gain, but also a 10 to 11% reduction in LDL cholesterol. But even from this study, it's unclear if it's the effect of the foods, for example, or the effect of displacement of specific displacement of the animal protein. Comparing these foods, the plant-based foods at higher fiber and lower saturated fat intakes compared to the corresponding animal foods. It's important to note when we start to transition dietary patterns to consume plant protein more often, it's important to note where we are today. This is a study looking at proportion of plant-based protein in dietary patterns in Canada on any given day using the Canadian Community Health Survey. And just to note here that the majority of individuals are consuming between 0 and 50% of their protein from animal sources. And that is 81% of Canadians on the day of this survey were getting most of their protein from animal sources on any given day. So the question is, are there nutritional implications to be considered in transitioning consumers to consuming plant protein more often? And with that, I'm going to really hone in now on protein quality and bring protein quality into the mix and into the story. So the question is, what is protein quality? Well, it really is consuming adequate levels of digestible, indispensable amino acids, and it describes the characteristics of a protein in relation to its ability to achieve defined metabolic actions. It's dependent on two factors, really: the supply of indispensable amino acids, which are those amino acids that we cannot manufacture in the body, and the digestibility of those amino acids. So if we compare broadly plant-based protein and animal-based protein, there are some distinctions that need to be considered when we talk about protein quality. Animal-based proteins generally are higher in protein, which is to be expected. They contain high levels of all the indispensable amino acids, and generally the digestibility is fairly high, at greater than 90%. It's important because digestibility in this context is used as a proxy for bioavailability. Plant protein, on the other hand, can be high in protein, which is also to be expected, but generally it's lower in one or more indispensable amino acids. And the digestibility of these proteins can be moderate to high, from 70 to 90%. So generally speaking, when we talk about plant proteins have a lower protein quality compared to animal proteins. And that's demonstrated here. If we look at a comparison here of various plant proteins with the clear bars, animal proteins in the shaded bars, and then human muscle in the dark bar, you can see here that the protein content is generally similar between various protein sources here. These are plant-based protein isolates that were examined. But look at the essential amino acids, a proportion of the total protein. It's quite a bit lower in some of the plant-based proteins, but across all of the plant-based or the animal sources of protein, it's generally much higher. And if we compare two indispensable amino acids here, lysine and methionine, in comparing across the board, animal proteins are meeting thresholds for amino acid requirements according to WHO, where the ability to meet lysine and methionine requirements are fairly mixed, and in most cases quite a bit lower than those requirements from the WHO. So if we quantify protein quality using the protein digestibility correct amino acid score here on the x-axis, which is a measurement of protein quality, which considers levels of indispensable amino acids as well as their digestibility, you can see here to the right of this hashed line, which are mostly the animal sources, with the exception of soy protein, fairly high PDCAS or measure of protein quality. And this really start to taper off as you move across the board for various plant sources of protein. So how do we tackle this? How do we tackle this? Well, part of the answer is looking at complementarity of amino acids. It turns out if you mix and match various plant sources of protein, you can make up for shortfalls in amino acids. So for example, pulses are generally lower in sulfur amino acids and higher in lysine, and cereals are lower in lysine and higher in sulfur amino acids. And that's actually demonstrated in this slide here, that when we look at methionine, which is a sulfur amino acid, and lysine, there seems to be some complementarity here. Those foods that are higher in lysine are generally lower in methionine, and and vice versa. And you can see here, pea, for example, high in lysine, lower in methionine, wheat, low in lysine and higher in methionine. Seeing that complementarity can be demonstrated with this slide. Looking at almonds, for example, which is a fairly low PDCAS, and adding modest amounts of pulses, you can get a fairly large jump in PDCAS, upwards of 20 to 30%, depending on which pulse and how much pulses are being added. And this is important because when we look at the way to communicate protein foods in Canada and the US, it's not only dependent on protein quantity, but also protein quality. And when we look at some of the foods that are promoted in dietary guidelines, or plant protein foods that are promoted in dietary guidelines, like pulses, most pulses on their own cannot meet the threshold for making a protein claim, which means in the grocery store, they cannot be communicated to consumers as a source of protein. And again, this is important because when we evaluate what resonates most with consumers around protein and them choosing protein foods, that basic good source of protein claim resonates quite highly. Now we look at functional drivers and using technology to align with consumers' expectations. From a technological front, the industry has done quite well in addressing things like technical functionality and sensory functionality. The new foods entering the market are very well accepted by consumers. They're performing how one would expect them to perform if they were consuming, for example, the animal-based, the corresponding animal product, which it's replacing or which they're choosing as a replacement for. But where the challenge still remains and has been, I think, more increasingly highlighted is the nutritional value of these foods. This is a quote from Arif Fazal, the founder and managing director of Blueberry Ventures, from an article in Forbes that says there's white space around the trifecta of taste, price, and nutritional profile. Nutritional profiles have left something to be desired. They'd love to see more tasty products that are highly nutrient dense. This is a study looking at the replacement of animal products in the diet for corresponding plant products, and then looking at the dietary quality of each by substitution category and main ingredient. And then the PAN diet score is a measure of dietary quality. The higher the score, the higher dietary quality. And just a note here that while there are some significant differences and significant increases in either way, in either method of looking at the data, the effects are mixed and fairly modest. And one would argue that while significantly higher in some cases significantly lower, the effects are really not mind-blowing, forgive me for using that term, with respect to improvement in dietary quality. And why would that be? Well, let's take a look at what animal products do bring to the diet. Many would argue that, you can consume animal products as a part of a healthy diet. They have been in the past. Animal products do bring high protein to the diet. They're high in protein quality. They bring B vitamins to the diet. Dairy products are vitamin D fortified in Canada and US. But what happens when we use plant-based ingredients to produce some of these corresponding products? Well, in many cases, the fiber and micronutrients are being removed. So at the end of the day, you're left with an innovative product that could be high in protein. But the question is, what happens to protein quality? And you're not getting these other attributes that you could be removing as a replacement food. That's not to say that innovation isn't making great strides in this place. I'm just trying to highlight here where some of the gaps could be in the innovation and some of the things that are being highlighted currently as these feeds are being looked at in more of a nutritional lens. And this is nothing new. There's numerous reports of this, like this, in the scientific literature. This is a nutritional comparison of different dairy alternatives or dairy beverages, looking at in comparison to cow's milk. And just note here, with the exception of soy, fairly low protein in almond, rice, coconut, and oat milk. And a quote here from a recent review of these products, indicating that with the exception of soy beverages, most of the products in their comparison had relatively little protein, and there's a need for more plant-based protein with protein levels that are comparable to milk. This is important because in many instances, consumers are not educated. And in some cases in the United States, where the regulatory environment is very different from Canada. So I'm going to bring some context to this. This is in the US. Scott Gottlieb, in 2018, who is the commissioner of the FDA, indicated that the FDA intends to look at whether parents may be erroneously assuming that plant-based beverages' nutritional contents are similar to cow's milk, despite the fact that some of these products contain only a fraction of the protein or other nutrients found in cow's milk. There have been case studies in the US where parents are assuming that some of these alternative dairy products have the same nutritional profile of milk, feeding them on an ongoing basis to their children. And there's been some case reports of the development of things like rickets and kwashiorkor. Various authoritative statements have come out from various associations outlining some of the challenges and position statements on consuming some plant-based dairy alternative milks in children. Later this year, between now and 2018, it's anticipated the FDA is going to be publishing some guidance around labeling plant-based milk alternatives and plant-based alternatives to animal-derived foods because of some of the controversy and some of the topics that have been highlighted across the United States. This was a comparison in the United States of various plant-based ground beef products, vegan and non-vegan, to real ground beef from 70 to 90% lean. And just to note that the protein levels were substantially lower, with a median protein level in the plant-based products of 7.2 to 12.6 grams and ranging from 21.5 to 22.6 grams in the real ground beef. Similar analysis in the UK demonstrated that plant-based sausages compared to, animal-based sausages and other products like burgers, poultry, and meatballs had 19 to 35% lower protein, assuming here that would also bring, in some cases, when we factor in protein quality, a lower protein quality score to those diets. And then even in the media, this is from Julian Mellenton, who was, comparing plant-based cheese product to a real cheese product, noting the disparity in protein content of 1.3 grams to 25.4 grams in the cheddar cheese product, but also noting similar saturated fat intakes. So that brings me to the final part of my presentation. How do we bring protein quality into the protein conversation and address some of the gaps that are being demonstrated in protein quality as a functional value proposition in the innovation pipeline? And I would argue for this presentation, let's focus on diversifying plant protein offerings. And to do that, to start this off, I want to talk about where we are in terms of protein recommendations. So protein recommendations right now used by Canada and the US are, with respect to an estimated average requirement, which are the requirements for about 50% of the population, is about 0.66 grams of protein per kilogram per day. And the RDA for about 97.5% of the population is at 0.8 grams per day. And it's important to note that these recommendations were derived based on high quality protein intake. Even in the vegetarian diets that were evaluated when coming up with this recommendation back in 2000, when this was published in 2005, even those vegetarian diets had a high degree of complementarity amongst plant proteins and achieved a high protein quality with respect to protein intake. It gets even a little bit more controversial. We talk about, having protein recommendations for all adults across the lifespan, when there's some evidence demonstrating that individuals at different points in their lifespan of adulthood could benefit from a higher or different RDA in the AR that is prescribed for the general adult population. Specifically, men and women greater than 70, it's been proposed having an RDA of around 1.2 and an EAR at around 0.9 to account for some of the metabolic changes that happen amongst the elderly. This was a study that I was a part of in collaboration with James House from the University of Manitoba, numerous individuals from the University of Toronto, and colleagues from Loblaws, again asking the question, on any given day, what happens to the absolute protein intake as well as the corrected protein intake or protein quality diet as plant protein increases in the diet. And note here, as we move across quartiles, increasing the proportion of plant protein in the diet, there in some cases is a dramatic decrease in the absolute protein intake, particularly from quartile 2 to quartile 3 and quartile 4 of the diet. And if we apply that correction factor, PD-Cas, which is essentially a correction factor for protein quality, Note that it moves from almost perfect in quartile 1 with the lowest amount of plant protein to almost to drop it around 30 points to 0.71 in the highest quartile of plant protein, with a dramatic drop between quartile 2 and quartile 3, which is demonstrated here at an 18 and 29% drop in absolute and corrected protein intake. Note here 80 grams of corrected protein down to 58.16 grams of corrected protein in quartile 3. So why is that? Well, when we look at the protein sources across quartiles, particularly in quartile 3 and 4, the vast majority of the plant protein is from one category of foods, and that is cereals and grains. So essentially, you're not getting that complementarity that you'd be looking for to maintain levels of indispensable amino acids in the diet. And note that non-soy legumes like pulses and soy represent fairly minor components of the total protein intake. So how do we improve the protein quality of diets to achieve levels that are aligned with recommendations? Well, there are numerous avenues can go. Technology is using various processing methodologies to improve digestibility. We can increase portion size, for example, which might not be feasible. We could fortify with specific amino acids, which there are specific requirements for different types of foods from a regulatory perspective. But what I'm going to focus on today is combining food groups together to achieve complementarity in dietary patterns, similar to what I've demonstrated here. This was a study from the study conducted in France from their national survey from 2006 to 2007. And what it demonstrates here is the prevalence of lysine inadequacy as you replace animal protein with plant protein at various degrees, but as a proportion of that plant protein replacement that is being used, you incorporate various degrees of legumes, nuts, and seeds. The primary source of plant protein in the diets amongst individuals in this group was cereals at 21 and 20% amongst men and women, then a dramatic drop off to potatoes, fruit, vegetables, nuts and seeds, and legumes. But focusing on legumes, nuts, and seeds as a proportion of that replacement protein for that animal protein demonstrated a massive reduction, or modeled a massive reduction in prevalence of lysine adequacy, demonstrating protein quality complementarity. In a similar study replacing animal protein foods, an isoenergetic replacement of animal protein foods with a diversified mix of plant protein, demonstrated, again, dramatic improvements in the dietary quality compared to just a one-to-one replacement with the initial food pattern. And this is a study using the National Health and Nutrition Examination Study in the US. This is a study to which myself, Kevin Miller from General Mills, and Victor Falgoni are a part of. This data has been submitted for publication, where we evaluated the quartiles of plant protein usual intake in the United States based on the 3 cycles of NHANES from 2013 to 2018 across almost 15,000 participants, noting that in quartile 4, plant protein cutoff was greater than 36.2%, indicating that the vast majority of individuals are consuming a considerable amount of animal protein. But note that across the baseline analysis, that there was a drop in PDCAS across the quartiles, which is to be expected. But when we modeled the replacement of amino acids from grain foods with amino acids from legumes and lentils from 25 to 50%, we got a 1 to 10% increase in PDCAS, primarily with the biggest jumps happening in quartiles 3 and 4, demonstrating that complementarity happening on that side of things. So with that, I just want to show this complementarity piece with a real world example of a dairy alternative found in the Canadian marketplace, containing the first one here on the left, containing almonds at 1 gram protein per serving. And then the one on the right containing almonds, pea, and cashew with 8 grams of proteins per serving, and then able to make that protein claim indicating on front of pack that the product contains 8 grams of protein, like dairy milk. So that brings me to the last part of my presentation today, how do we enhance the diversity of plant protein in Canadian diets from protein quality and nutrition functionality, noting, the challenges that we inherently have? Well, I think there's an opportunity, first and foremost, to review and perhaps modernize Canada's regulatory framework for protein nutrient content claims. And the question is, while regulations are in place to ensure consumers are consuming high quality proteins with respect to, I guess, every food that they consume, on the other side of things, is it the chicken or the egg? But are the regulations preventing consumers' ability to identify plant protein foods in the marketplace? This is a conversation that's been happening for a number of years, and to which I've been a part of with colleagues from the University of Toronto, Intertech, the University of Guelph, as well as Loblaws. And then the quote standing question in this regard is, how would regulatory changes affect the food and dietary landscape? And is the expectation that every protein consumed is of high quality on its own? And there are some initiatives and some research initiatives in place in Canada hoping to delineate this over the next few years. In addition to this, a few years ago, the Canadian Nutrition Society hosted a workshop to which this report or proceedings was published, entitled Translating Protein Foods from the New Canada's Food Guide to Consumers' Knowledge Gaps and Recommendations, where they indicate some pathways forward for educating and increasing the prominence of high quality protein foods in the Canadian diets, which include developing key messages and communication strategy for protein foods, review of nutrition policies to ensure adequate intake of protein and indispensable amino acids, obviously food literacy and education for children and families, and develop a research strategy around protein foods, which I'm hoping that the some of the initiatives that I indicated or alluded to on the previous slide would feed into quite nicely to this identified tactic. So with that, key takeaways from my presentation: the plant protein food sector has experienced considerable growth, consumer demand tied to health, the environment, animal welfare, dietary variety, again, these are important topics, and largely, in many instances, emotional drivers, which is great. But protein quality and protein food offerings support the nutritional expectations of consumers as a functional driver of purchase intent. As technology is leveraged to transition consumers to diets with more plant protein quality should be a nutritional consideration during the innovation process. Plant protein diversity for complementation can be an efficient means for increasing the protein quality of dietary patterns that incorporate plant protein more often, and bringing more plant variety into dietary patterns that align with, I think, some of the rationale as to why plant protein is being advocated by policymakers in the context of healthy dietary guidelines and dietary patterns. And with that, I want to thank you for taking the time, and again for listening to my presentation, and again the invitation to presenting to you today.